A2IM, the collective voice of independent music.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Serona for joining me in this venture today, and also thank all the folks at A2IM for inviting the both of us. We're going to talk about revenue for a little bit, and we'll talk about two sides of the funnel. I'm going to speak to what goes into the funnel, and Serona will touch on how things get distributed once they come out of the funnel. I know in the music business we tend to have a lot of terms. We talk about sync and penny rates and licensing and royalties and PROs and PPRs and so on. So I'm going to introduce what may be a new term for you, which is ARPU. And when I've given this presentation before, I always start with asking folks, do they know who ARPU is and why should they care about it? So let me give a brief introduction about what ARPU stands for. It is not Kim Jong-un's favorite K-pop band. It is also not the sound that a pirate makes when they have an upset stomach. What it actually stands for is average revenue per user. And it's fundamentally the dollar value that the industry gets from each one of its customers. And I'll be talking about what goes into the top of the funnel. In essence, all of the money that consumers are contributing to the music business and where it comes from. The other thing about ARPU is that we often talk about it as an indicator of brand health. How healthy is a brand? Well, ideally, if it has a lot of ARPU and that ARPU trend is going up, we tend to think that a brand or a service is doing well. If it has less ARPU or it's going down, in general, you think it's not quite so healthy. But there are exceptions to that I'll talk about in a second. So let me introduce you to a couple of concepts around ARPU. I'll just bring this home. For me, we spend about $220 a month on our cable bill. That includes basic cable, plus HBO and Showtime, the phone, 5 cable boxes, 2 DVRs, my upgraded Wi-Fi, and then, of course, there's any other on-demand movies that I buy a la carte, so maybe they're $5 or $6 a piece. So $220 goes for all of those little bits and pieces, and then there's additional ARPU that I spend by renting movies. The same thing is true, so you could associate that to your own bills as well. So the same thing is true when we start to look at properties in the music business. If, for example, you take a look at the financials of SiriusXM, all the time they're reporting what their ARPU number is. I've circled it there right in the middle. And last year Sirius reported average revenue per user or monthly ARPU of $13.95. So translated, what that means is that Sirius is getting about $167 per year from each of its customers. If you think about the average live customer, they contribute about $400 a year to the industry. If they're a merch buyer, they contribute to about $125. But if you take a look at Spotify, what's really interesting is that if you go back a few years to 2015, their ARPU number was about $7 a month from each of their customers, or about roughly about $90. And you can see how their ARPU number has been going down. Now, what's really interesting is that ARPU can go down when you're expanding the business. So, for example, if you're offering a lot of trials, or if you're expanding globally, the monthly fees that you may be getting in some countries are not the same as you got in the United States and Western Europe. That's how you can see ARPU going down. So, in the case of trial or in the case of fairly rapid expansion, while I said earlier that generally an upward trend is good, sometimes it's okay for ARPU to be going down, so long as that when you look at a time horizon, you can imagine a picture where you'll actually be have that ARPU number trending up. In essence, what we're saying here is, would you like 1 million customers, each of whom are spending $8, or would you like 10 million customers, each of whom are spending $4? Personally, I'll take all things being equal, I'll take the 40 million over the 8 million. So how does this relate to some of the historical music trends? Well, if you take a look at the ARPU for U.S. recorded music, you have to start out with the number of fans or the number of consumers who are contributing to the pool. If we go back to 1999, which is peak CDs, you had about almost 180 million people buying CDs. Those were the days where we regularly went into stores and purchased a CD, where everybody got a couple of CDs for the holidays. And the business back then was, somewhere in the area of $14-15 billion in the U.S. As you look, you could see by the time we got to 2017, that number had been cut by about half. We only had about 85 million customers. Now, the really good news is that over the past couple of years, the number of customers have started to rebound. So, even though we're still in a growth mode for streaming, and we've seen a decline in the number of people who are buying both downloads and CDs, we are seeing the overall base of customers, or in this case we could call them users, actually starting to trend up again, which is terrific. Now the question is, well, how much does each of those customers spend? And if you take a look at the numbers, or in this case the ARPU numbers for recorded music, going back to 1999, we were spending an average of $83 per buyer, mostly on CDs. And if you adjust that for inflation, that's about $122 in current dollars. Nowadays, that ARPU number is $84. So in essence, we're pretty much in the same place that we were 20 years ago, and actually a little bit behind if you adjust it for inflation. So I think the mission that we have to think about in the music industry is, how do we continually raise the ARPU? How do we both increase the number of customers, which has been happening in the paid streaming side of things, but also how do we get them to spend more? And just to give you a sense, if that $84 number, if we added $9 per customer to that, that would be equivalent to another $1 billion in revenue for the U.S. recorded music industry. So let's go back and talk about a couple of ways that we can look at these ARPU numbers. If, for example, we had just stuck with CDs and downloads, and I know, it's very the whole topic of dollars and payouts around streaming, very controversial. And people like to often criticize a lot of the stakeholders for saying, hey, there's just not enough of a payout. But actually, if we had stuck with the older models, certainly it's the CD model and the download model, those were already in decline in terms of their contribution, their revenue contribution, starting all the way back in the mid-2000s. If you go back to 2004, ARPU for CD and download buyers was about $61, and you could see how it drifted down to $52 and then $50. I mean, it's currently all the way down to $29. But to think that, if we just stuck with the halcyon days of CDs and downloads, there would be more money, that's actually a mistaken belief. The revenue is actually in decline. And one of the reasons for that is that downloads themselves really never sold enough. There was never enough of a customer base for digital downloads to replace what we got used to in the peak CD years of the late 1990s. So along comes streaming, and what do those numbers look like? Well, if you take a look at the number of paid on-demand subscribers, and this is just on-demand, it doesn't include interactive subscribers like Pandora Plus, just go back not even a decade ago to 2011, there were only about 2.5 million people who were subscribing to one of the services in the U.S. That went up to 8.3 and 14.8. And then just a couple of years ago, we really started to see explosive growth in the number of on-demand subs. Spotify hit its stride. Apple was introduced and really started to grow exponentially, and then, of course, got some on-demand services from Amazon and Pandora. So now we're at a point where we've got about 80 million paid on-demand subs. What's really interesting, though, is that the ARPU, the amount of dollars that are being spent, has really been pretty steady over the past couple of years. It's hovering around $80. So I think we have to ask ourselves the question, which, by the way, is still better than we would have had if we were just still went back to that panacea of CDs and downloads, which were only around $50. So the question is, if we're around $80, how do we actually improve the spending, consumer spending on streaming? And I'll raise a couple of potential things for you to think about. Number one is we can raise price. And I know that's very controversial, and it's much more complicated than I'm going to make it out to be in this next minute or two. But I think if you take a look at some of the consumer metrics, there would be a willingness to accept higher prices. Why do I think that? If you take a look at Apple Music, for example, here's some consumer survey information that we gather. 65% of people who use Apple Music absolutely love it. So there's pretty good passion and association. And the same thing, you'll find the same thing when you take a look at Spotify Premium, for example. If you ask them what's actually important in terms of their usage, they'll talk about things like it's easy to use on my phone. I can save music and listen offline. They actually believe it provides higher quality audio, even though it potentially might not. But you see things like the ease of use and the ease of getting recommendations and the ease of and the discovery experience. All of these things have intrinsic value. They provide what economists would call utility. And then in research, we also use a term called Net Promoter Score. So think about it this way. If you passed 100 people on the street and you ask them, do you really love Apple Music? Do you hate Apple Music? Are you kind of not neutral about it? Here, 68 out of 100 would say that they like it a lot and that they would recommend it. Only 11 say, nah, not so good. And that gives you a net promoter score of 57, which is pretty good. So my point being that when you look at all of the diagnostics for the paid streaming services, generally there's a high level of utility and a high level of passion for the services, which typically says if you needed to raise price a little bit, you probably could. The other thing that we're facing is, if you remember the days of Napster and piracy and CD burning and ripping, we're seeing the same kind of thing happening in the subscription service sector of things. We now have about 80 million paid streamers in total. That includes on-demand and the non-interactive services. But about 23 million are getting a login for somewhere, and it's not a family plan. They don't know where they're getting it from their friends, from their uncle, from their barber. And 2 out of 3 of them know that it's not from a legitimate family plan, so about 15 million. So one of the things that we could be doing is taking more action to say, look, we need to cut the sharing down a little bit and either move people onto family plans, which command a higher price, or get them to hopefully trade up in total to a personally paid subscription service. So when you've got 2 or 3 users on a service and only one person paying, in a sense, you're naturally inhibiting the amount of revenue per user. Other things that you could do, when you take a look at features that could be added to streaming services, something that we call an enhanced streaming service. We asked consumers a couple of years ago, would they be interested in something that would actually offer more features? And about a third of them said that they would. And we put this out as a streaming service that was, instead of $9.99, that would be $16.99 a month. And what could that look like? Well, it's kind of prescient at the moment, where they said, well, what would you like? We'd like live streams of a concert. We'd like full concert recordings. We'd like access to some of the music from our favorite artists that are not available on the regular service. Things like sound quality as good as in the recording studio, which is very consistent with what's going on with high-res and high-def initiatives, and so on. And even you can see at the bottom, this was the pretty early days of podcasts. People even said that they pay a little more to have podcasting services in. So my point being is that by bundling up more features into the service, this would be one way to raise ARPU by simply putting in a more enhanced service and charging more for it. And the one thing that I want to point out is just keep in mind that no two music fans are exactly the same. We do an awful lot of segmentation of music fans in the United States. Here's just one example. So if you take a look at somebody who is, what we would call a music hedonist, they spend a lot of money. They pay for a streaming service. They buy CDs. They buy downloads. They spend a lot of money on live. These are folks, and if you thought about this, actually spending $2 or $3 extra a month on a streaming service is going to be nothing to them. They would jump at the chance to get these enhanced features. They'd be willing to pay a little bit more because in the scheme of all of their spending on music, it doesn't mean a whole lot to them. But there are other segments also. There are the segment that we call potentials. They're streaming, but they don't currently pay at the moment. But they're interested in understanding what a paid service would offer them. So potentially you could take that $96 that they spend every single month and jump it up to $110, $120 by adding a paid subscription service into their portfolio. So these are just a couple of thoughts that we have in terms of how do you grow ARPU, how do you enhance the funnel at the top side of things. So let me wrap up before I turn this over to Serona, and just recapping here a little bit, that ARPU is one of the many indicators that we have of industry health. And as I said, growing ARPU is generally better, but if you're expanding into new territories or if you're heavily focused on customer acquisition, that might reduce your ARPU in the short term. For recorded music specifically, certainly the amount that people are spending lags what we used to spend in the peak CD years of the late 90s. But I think streaming is replacing rapidly declining CD and download spend. So at some point when we get to peak streaming, and maybe we could charge a little bit more by some of the mechanisms that I spoke about, the amount of revenue will certainly increase. Things that we might do to get there, raise price, but as I know, it's much more complicated than it appears. But consumers, I believe, would be willing to add another dollar or two to what they spend every single month. We can limit account sharing, convert more people to full plans or to family plans. We can leverage things like consumer segmentation and offer certain fans enhanced streaming features or bundles at a higher price. And certainly there are a lot of people out there who are still free-only streamers. There's about 50 million people in the United States who stream but don't even use a paid service at all, not even sharing it. So there's still a lot of potential to get more customers into that funnel. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Serona, and she could talk about what happens when the revenue comes out the other side.
Thank you, Russ. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much to A2IM for having me be a part of this. Hopefully in the future I'll be invited back and get to see you guys in person. So I'm going to talk to you about what happens to the revenue that comes out of the streaming services. So for today's discussion, we're actually going to limit the discussion to three of the most popular streaming models: interactive audio, non-interactive audio, and interactive video. And as we go through this conversation, it's going to be important to understand the path that revenue takes related to the part of the content that we're discussing. So there's musical works. Sometimes we use the word songs or compositions interchangeably with that. There's the audio recordings, and then there's the video recordings. And so there is no one single path for each of these three streaming models. You'll see on the next few slides how the path depends on which piece of the content we're talking about. So let's start by looking at interactive audio. And by this, I'm talking about services like Spotify, Apple Music, There are certainly others. And in this context, we're talking about the consumer being able to specifically choose what they're listening to. So they're pressing play, if you want to think of it like that, and they can play their favorite recording over and over again, which will be different than what we're going to talk about in a minute with non-interactive audio. So for interactive audio, there's actually three paths that revenue takes. The first has to do with the musical work, and that's the public performance piece. The second piece is also connected to the musical work, and that's the reproduction and distribution piece. And the third is to do with the sound recording, and this is also related to the reproduction and distribution. So I will warn you, those terms, public performance, reproduction, distribution, those do come out of the copyright law. You might have guessed that already. And they speak specifically to the kind of rights that are involved in enabling this type of a service. And so the revenue that flows from that really has to do with securing the rights and compensating rights holders. So looking first at the public performance path, the rates for public performance, we're talking about the rates between what a Spotify would pay to an ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, Global Music Rights. The rates that the streaming services pay to the performing rights organizations are arrived at either by a negotiation with the performing rights organization, or if a negotiation does not succeed, if they're not able to agree on a rate, then there's, in the case of ASCAP and BMI, there's actually a federal rate court in the Southern District of New York that will hear the matter and make a ruling. And there are some other things in place for the PROs that are not governed by that rate court, but ultimately it's set either as a result of a negotiation or some sort of proceeding. So the money flows from Spotify, Apple Music, interactive audio services through to the performing rights organization. And then the performing rights organization pays two different sets of parties. The first is they pay music publishers. And in a lot of cases, especially when you talk about sort of the do-it-yourself singer-songwriter type of creator, you have a songwriter who does not have a relationship with an existing music publisher. They're acting as their own music publisher. And on these slides, I refer to them as self-administered songwriters. They are acting as their own publisher. And so a PRO will pay a certain amount of money it collects to music publishers of the musical works that are involved. And in the case of a songwriter who is acting as themselves as the publisher, they will also receive that portion of what we like to call the publisher share. You might hear that terminology used sometimes in the context of performing rights royalties. You'll hear publisher share and writer share. So you have the publisher share being paid directly to the publishers, or the songwriters acting as their own publishers. And then you have an additional piece, the other half, that's paid to songwriters. Even songwriters who have a relationship with the music publisher, they still get their public performance royalties directly from the performing rights organization. So if you're a songwriter that's signed to a music publisher, the songwriter, you're getting a check from the PRO, the music publisher is getting a check from the PRO. If you're a do-it-yourself singer-songwriter, you're getting both pieces of this money. You're kind of wearing both hats. And then actually, there's a whole other complexity that, in the interest of time, I left off of these slides. But nowadays, in the music publishing field, many songwriters have negotiated the kinds of deals that get referred to as co-publishing deals or publishing administration deals, where actually that songwriter is also entitled to a portion of that quote-unquote publisher share. So they don't receive only the songwriter share, they're also then splitting that other half that we call the publisher share. They're getting a piece of that as well as the music publisher they've done a deal with. So in terms of, how songwriters and music publishers are receiving revenue from activity on interactive streaming services, they're getting payments from their affiliated performing rights organization. The second path related to this has to do with, we call the mechanicals. So this is also related to the musical work, and this is a royalty related to the right to reproduce and distribute these musical works. And so this rate is generally set by statute. It's actually set by a body called the Copyright Royalty Board, call that the CRB. The CRB has what we call rate proceedings, and they make decisions on what the rates should be. Sometimes there's an entire industry agreement on the rates, and that's great. It's not really a contested matter. But if parties disagree on what the rate should be, this Copyright Royalty Board can reach that conclusion. And even if the parties do agree, it has to be blessed by the Copyright Royalty Board. So it is the case. I've heard of at least one case with an interactive audio streaming service where they've actually negotiated for a different rate than the statutory rate, and that's because they're paying more than the statutory rate for a lot of other reasons that we won't get into here, as I don't want to give them away. But generally, this rate is considered statutory. And so we have a new flow, a new path that will be in place starting next January. And I'm sure you've heard all about this. There's a new organization called the Mechanical Licensing Collective, who actually it's MLC, the Mechanical Licensing Collective. And this organization is being created because of a mandate from the Music Modernization Act, change to the copyright law that was signed into law in 2018. And so royalties coming from interactive audio services through to music publishers and songwriters for the right to reproduce and distribute their musical works, that so-called mechanical right, that money is going to be routed through the MLC. And the MLC, and if you'll note here underneath the MLC, I have the little word or instead of the word and. We have the word and under the PROs. We have the word or. And that's because the MLC doesn't pay songwriters the same way that the PROs do. PROs pay songwriters directly and music publishers directly. The Mechanical Licensing Collective will be paying music publishers, and the music publishers will then pay the songwriters that are associated with them. And if you are a songwriter who is acting as your own music publisher, that's self-administered songwriter, then you will get paid from the MLC, but there's going to be a lot of songwriters who have done deals with music publishers that will not be being paid through the MLC. They will get that money through their publisher. So it's a slightly different model. There's two arrows there, but it's an or, not an and. So that's coming very soon. And then the third path related to royalties, revenue, however you want to refer to it, for interactive audio streaming has to do with the use of the recording itself. And so in this context, this is all negotiated between these services and the different recording distributors. And frankly, it's often pretty confidential. There are things here and there that get reported in the press about just exactly what percentage of revenue a Spotify or an Apple Music makes that they will pay to the recording distributors, but it's not publicly known because it is negotiated and rather sensitive, as you can imagine. So there is an amount of money. It's the lion's share of the money. I think that's pretty well understood, that gets paid through to the recording distributors. And by that, I'm talking about it could be a major record company. It could be an independent distribution company. It could be a do-it-yourself sort of DistroKid, TuneCore type company, the different parties that have these deals with the interactive audio services. So that piece of this path flows through them, and then they continue to pay down that path to whoever the rights holders are. And those, that arrangement is going to take a number of forms. So if that recording distributor is a major record company, then they're bringing that money into the corporation, and, they have their own internal processes about how much of that revenue then moves on and is counted for the record labels that they own, or the record labels that they distribute, and so on down to paying the artists, the producers, and other creators involved in that project. And so how many more levels down after the recording distributor past step is going to vary, and how much each party further down that chain is going to hold on to, that's going to vary pretty significantly. You also have the little word or here. It's really small, I know. And so in the case of a do-it-yourself artist who may be going through a DistroKid, and even a small record label who may be going through that kind of a service. Once it comes from the streaming service to that party, then they're going to pay on either 100% or less than that, depending on the arrangement when the party signed up with them, of that revenue onto that self-released artist or perhaps that record label that goes through that service. So those are the pathways that the revenue flows for an interactive audio service. So let's take a look at non-interactive audio services. So by this, for example, you have Pandora, and by Pandora, I mean sort of the Pandora most of us are more familiar with. Pandora has also launched its own interactive services. Those would fall onto the bucket of the slide we just covered. Pandora, sort of traditional Pandora radio type model, Sirius XM, other webcasters. So in this case, what makes it non-interactive is that the consumer can certainly pick the channel, just like you could have picked the channel on the FM radio dial. You can pick the channel. You might be able to do a thumbs up or thumbs down, but you couldn't pick your favorite recording and play it on repeat 20 times. So that's what makes these non-interactive. That's the terminology that's used. And so in this context, we actually have two paths that the revenue flows. The first is for public performance. Again, we just covered that. Same thing here, public performance of the musical work. So this all looks really the same. It's money going to the publishers and the songwriters, right? The PROs pay both of those parties. And if you have a songwriter who is acting as their own publisher, then they get both pieces. Otherwise, it's divided between publishers and songwriters. But what we have here that's different than we had on the prior slide is here we have something called digital performance related to the sound recordings. So sound recordings in the United States have slightly different protections under copyright law than musical works do. Musical works, if they are publicly performed, the copyright law protects that as a right that says you can't publicly perform a musical work if you don't have permission. And you're probably not going to get permission if you don't pay a royalty. And that's what our whole PRO world is all about. But the copyright law does not grant exactly that same kind of protection to sound recordings. Currently, the copyright law in the U.S., and we're really one of the only ones in the world like this, the U.S. copyright law says if you're going to perform that sound recording on FM radio or in a nightclub, there is not a public performance right. There's no permission you have to get with respect to the recording, except we do have one for digital transmissions. So these are not exactly equivalent. The sound recording set of rights is smaller than the musical works one, but in the context of digital performance, we do have both of these pieces here. So this rate is statutory. It is set again by the Copyright Royalty Board. And all of this money flows through the one single organization charged with this in the U.S. called Sound Exchange. And hopefully all of you are very familiar with Sound Exchange. And so Sound Exchange receives all of this digital performance revenue related to the recordings, the sound recordings, and here we're only talking audio, not talking anything about video, audio only, and then they actually pay that out to three different kinds of parties. And all of this is dictated by law. And so they pay a portion to the record companies, and that's generally 50% of the performance revenue that they receive from these kinds of services. That's set by the statute. 50% goes to record companies. Really, it's worded in the law as it going to the sound recording copyright owner. And so again, if you have a DIY artist who owns their own recordings, they're going to get this piece of the money. So 50% goes to the record company and the sound recording copyright owner. 45% goes to what they call the featured artist. And so, that could be the band if it's a band, or if it's a solo artist. Sometimes you might have one artist featuring another artist, and then they're both considered the featured artist. So 45% gets paid directly to them, not through the record company they're signed to, but directly to them, very similar to the way PROs pay songwriters directly. Creators like that because it means that this money doesn't get offset against an unrecouped advance they may have with the record company. It's really important to the creator community. And so they pay a portion to the featured artist, 45%, and then 5% gets paid on to what they call the non-featured artists. These are all the other performers on the track, might be background vocals, and that's actually paid into a fund that then distributes that money out. So that's how the money flows through Sound Exchange. So how is a record company getting paid for Pandora, for Sirius XM? They're getting paid through Sound Exchange, generally speaking. There is one little thing you'll see the asterisk there. I tried to keep these slides as simple as possible and not have a zillion footnotes, which would be so easy to do. But I had to put one in here. It is the case that there is a handful of situations where one of these non-interactive audio services has entered into an agreement directly with a record company, where they're going to pay the record company directly. Generally, when that's happened, what has been agreed to, and some of this was reported in the media when some of these deals were first struck, that the portion that goes to artists will still be routed through Sound Exchange. Right? Artists don't want the fact that a record company has done a direct deal with Pandora, for example, to now mean that this revenue comes through the record company and gets used to offset unrecouped advances. So even when there's been these direct deals, it may be the case that a record company is not getting their piece of the money from Sound Exchange for that, but the artists are. One other thing to mention, you may have heard the term ephemeral. Also not as widely understood as some other things. So ephemeral reproductions. So what actually happens when these streaming services operate is there is actually the creation of a temporary copy of the recording in order to actually facilitate the stream. And so very, very technically, that is a reproduction as opposed to a performance. I know I'm getting into copyright terminology, but so it actually technically is a copy, and it's ephemeral because it's temporary. It's there and then it's gone. It's not like a permanent download or anything. And so there actually is, in the law, this is all contemplated. And so when Sound Exchange receives the money that they receive from services, there is a portion of that money that is automatically attributed to being ephemeral copies that gets spun off to the side. And that money, all of that money, ephemeral money, is about a reproduction. And so that money goes solely to the sound recording copyright owner, the record company usually, who then usually has a royalty obligation to the artist, just like they do for all other reproductions of the recordings, based on whatever that contractual relationship is. So Sound Exchange pays out the majority of their money is digital performance, and they're paying record companies and artists directly. But then there's also a piece that is for ephemeral copies, and that money goes only to the sound recording copyright owner, who then pays their artists based on whatever their contractual arrangement is. So this is the path for non-interactive audio streaming. Lastly, we're going to talk very briefly about interactive video. And so as you look at the slide, in some ways you can see, wow, that looks so much simpler. But I'll freely admit, I almost had to oversimplify at the expense of overcomplicating, because it is a lot more complicated. So I might have taken the easy way out on this. With respect to interactive video, you still have the musical work involved, and you have the public performance of the musical work, just like we've had on the other two scenarios. And you also then have the synchronization, the use of that music in a video content. And then the fact that that video content is going to be streamed over and over again. So that actually implicates a synchronization, right, and a reproduction, and I could almost argue reproduction and distribution. All baked in there, together. And so you have that whole aspect that we don't have with the other two in terms of the synchronization piece. And that is completely negotiated. There is no statutory license or a rate set by a court for what the owners of musical works are entitled to be paid for uses of their music and videos. That's all negotiated. And so that's one piece of the rights and the revenue flow that has to be addressed, and money has to flow to the rights holders for that. You also have use of a recording. Now, the recording can really be used in two ways, and the same is true for the musical work. With video on any of these platforms, you have video that, let's say it's a single track music video, good old-fashioned MTV music video. It's one song. The entire video is that one song. And let's make it easy. Let's assume that's actually the music video created by the record company or by the do-it-yourself artist, okay? So in that context, you have sort of so-called premium content. It's not user-generated. It's not a dancing baby video with music in the background. It's actually content created by a company who wants to push out their content on this platform as a music video, let's say. And in that music video, you've now got video content. Inside of it, you've got a recording, and inside of that, you've got a musical work. So you have these layers of rights and content all involved in that music video usage. And so with respect to sound recording copyright owners, there is this synchronization and this reproduction as well going on. And then the last little image there is the little film strip icon I use. And this has to do with the actual use of the video content. So, and this can come up in the context of music companies, of course, with music videos and other footage, but it also comes up in the context of other parties that control video content that makes its way into user-generated content. You think about sports and television networks and, all kinds of video content owners that are not related to music, whose content may make its way into some sort of user-generated content, that dancing baby video. And so in the context of how the revenue flows and the rights are administered, musical works, copyright owners, and generally we're talking music publishers and self-administered songwriters, there's a whole set of activities related to agreeing rates with them, compensating them, providing them with tools to identify when their content is used on these services, both to try and detect unauthorized uses and have those taken down, which is challenging to say the least. That's a whole nother topic. But also providing them with the opportunity, once they've identified something that is theirs, that they want to allow to remain on the service, being able to monetize it. And there's a whole set there of negotiations, depending on the size of the party, whether you're a major, whether you're an indie publisher, just exactly what is available to you in terms of what the offer is going to differ, of course. But so there's a set of revenue that has to be paid by these services out to the owners of the musical works. There's a second set of revenue to the sound recording copyright owners, and that's for both, the content they create as well as user-generated content. And a piece of revenue to the video owners. And really, in the context of music, that's the piece of this that is the music videos created by the record company or by the artist, where it's their recording embedded in their own video content. And so, they're perhaps talking to these platforms about both, what are you going to pay me when my audio recording is used in a dancing baby video? And what are you going to pay me when my music video is played on the platform? So it's complicated, and these negotiations are also highly confidential, highly sensitive. They are often widely criticized. One of the things that makes these services different than the other two services we talked about has to do with where their content comes from. In the other two contexts, generally you're talking about content coming from the content source, with various controls along the way to make sure that I don't send in, and pretend that the recording of Prince's Purple Rain is mine. I don't try to push that through DistroKid and get it on Spotify. So there are gates along the way, controls. They don't always work perfectly, that control what content makes its way onto interactive and non-interactive audio services. In the context of the video platforms, What makes them so appealing so broadly to people is the fact that, just Joe Q Public can upload their content. And that then creates a unique set of challenges about how that content is actually policed to ensure it doesn't infringe on others' copyrights. But because of that particular model, it changes the dynamics with respect to, relative bargaining powers and, all those kinds of things that come to the table when content owners in these services are negotiating. It's different than the other two. And which is why actually if you become a study of ARPU, now that you've had Russ explain it to you, you might generally see that the ARPU for a lot of video services is quite a bit lower than the other services. And a lot of that could be connected to the way they actually get their content and the relationships they have with content providers. And then whoever gets paid by these services, they then will pay their songwriter, their artist, whoever else they are obligated to pay, what other rights holders they're obligated to pay, because that type of revenue is generated based on the contract they have with them. So the last point I'll just make is that even once the money flows from these services into the hands of, let's say, the companies that are overseeing the content, the creation of it, the distribution of it, you then often see this revenue taking further paths outwards and being divided up even further, depending on the content itself and the number of contributors involved. And so, this one's probably rather obvious, but if you have a song written by 4 different writers, you're likely to have at least 4 different publishing entities. If each of those 4 writers has done a co-publishing deal with a publisher, you could end up with 8 publishers listed on that song, and all that money's got to be sliced and diced. And then on the recording side, you've got your main artists. They're going to have, what could look like a standard recording agreement type of model. It could be a joint venture or net revenue share type of agreement. Often in certain genres, it's very popular these days to have that guest artist on a track. And what that means is that artist is going to get a piece of the royalties, usually coming out of the main artist royalty pool. And if they're signed to another record label, that record label is going to get a piece of money as well. All of that is going to reduce generally how much money is going to go to the artist, the main artist of that recording. Then you need to layer in their producers and what kind of royalty they may be entitled to. Mixers, often these days, top mixers are actually, being able to negotiate for a royalty for the tracks they mix. Maybe it's a remix. You have a remixer involved. If you include a sample, now you're talking about particularly a sample that uses an existing recording. Not only will you be slicing and dicing the publishing a bit further, because now you have the writers of the sample and their publishers, but if it's a sound recording sample, now you have that other record company that's going to want also a royalty in return for agreeing to have its music used as a sample. And if you are a record company that is a signatory to the collective bargaining agreements with the union, there's also going to be revenue that has to be sent to the union according to those agreements based on the revenue generated. So ultimately, the quick takeaway of all this is it gets sliced and diced a lot of ways. Much of this is all negotiated. The most transparent of which has to do with where it's statutory, where it's actually set by the Copyright Royalty Board, and those rates are published. They're very visible. But a lot of the rest of this is a lot more opaque. They're sensitive, confidential deals. And bargaining power has a lot to do with how those deals play out. So that's the path that revenue takes once it comes out of the streaming services.